For the Graymore Police Department, pulling over a black Mercedes on a quiet Tuesday evening was supposed to be a routine power play. They believed they were cornering a criminal operating outside his jurisdiction, using the cover of darkness to flex their authority. However, the officers had no idea that the man behind the wheel wasn't a victim, he was the one hunting them. The dashboard clock glowed a faint amber 11:42 p.m. Supervisory Special Agent Davian Reynolds kept his hands draped loosely over the leather steering wheel of his unmarked agency vehicle, a late-model Mercedes C-Class, seized in a RICO case 2 years prior and repurposed for federal undercover work. Rain slicked the asphalt of Route 119, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights that lined the affluent, quiet streets of Graymore. Graymore was a wealthy insular suburb just outside the city limits. It boasted manicured lawns, sprawling colonial homes, and a police department with a reputation that was an open secret in law enforcement circles. The Graymore PD was notorious for revenue policing and aggressive profiling. If you didn't look like you belonged in Graymore, you were pulled over. If you challenged the officers, you were arrested. Civil rights complaints had piled up for a decade, but they were always buried in internal affairs shielded by a corrupt local government. Davion, a 42-year-old black man, wearing a simple dark grey crewneck sweater and jeans, knew this better than anyone. He was the lead investigator of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, currently building a massive federal civil rights and racketeering case against Graymore's Chief of Police Warren Hayes and his top brass. But tonight, Davion wasn't officially on the clock. He was just driving home from a grueling 14-hour strategy session at the federal building. He was exhausted. He just wanted to get to his apartment, pour a glass of bourbon, and sleep. A set of headlights swung out from a dark side street, aggressively catching up to Davion's bumper. Davion glanced in his rearview mirror. The silhouette of a Ford Explorer Interceptor was unmistakable. The cruiser rode his bumper for 3 full blocks. It was an intimidation tactic. The officer was running the plates, but because the Mercedes was registered to a shell corporation, used by the Department of Justice, nothing would come back except a generic corporate lease in Delaware. To a hungry local cop, a corporate-leased luxury car driven by an unknown black man late at night was fresh meat. Davion maintained exactly 35 miles per hour. He didn't swerve. He didn't brake hard. He gave them absolutely zero probable cause. It didn't matter. The red and blue lights erupted in the darkness, blindingly bright, followed by the short, aggressive whoop of the siren. Davion let out a slow, controlled breath. Here we go, he thought. He signaled smoothly, pulling over into the parking lot of a closed strip mall, positioning the car beneath the harsh glare of a halogen street lamp. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down all 4 windows, a standard procedure to put an approaching officer at ease. He placed both hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel. In the side mirror, he watched the driver's door of the cruiser open. Officer Brian Fowler stepped out. Fowler was 26, built like a linebacker with a tight buzz cut and a tactical vest weighed down by enough gear for a combat deployment. He walked with a heavy, swaggering strut, his right hand resting casually but purposefully on the butt of his sidearm. He stopped just behind the B-pillar of the Mercedes, keeping himself out of the immediate line of sight, and shined his heavy maglite directly into Davion's eyes. "License registration and proof of insurance," Fowler demanded. No greeting. No explanation for the stop. Just a barked order. Davion squinted against the blinding beam. "Good evening, officer. They're in my wallet in my right back pocket. The registration is in the glove box. How would you like me to proceed?" Davion's voice was calm, measured, and stripped of any anxiety. It was the voice of a man completely in control of his environment. And to an officer like Brian Fowler, that calmness was deeply offensive. It was perceived not as compliance, but as defiance. "I said give me your license," Fowler snapped, stepping closer, the beam of the flashlight tracking Davion's face. "Don't play games with me," moving deliberately, announcing every motion. Davion reached into his back pocket. He pulled out his wallet, leaving the badge side tightly pinned closed, and extracted his Illinois driver's license. He handed it through the window. Fowler snatched it. He stared at the license, then down at Davian. Davian Reynolds. You're a long way from home, Davian. What are you doing in Greymore? I'm just driving through on my way home, officer. Davian replied neutrally. May I ask why I was pulled over? You drifted over the double yellow line back on Elm. Fowler lied smoothly. It was a practiced lie, unprovable without dashcam footage, which Greymore cruisers mysteriously always seemed to lose when complaints were filed. And your left tail light is out. I'll be sure to get that checked, Davian said, knowing full well the vehicle had been fully serviced and inspected that morning by the Bureau's motor pool. Fowler leaned closer, sniffing the air inside the cabin. It was the oldest trick in the dirty cop playbook. Whose car is this? It's registered to an LLC in Delaware. It's a company vehicle, Davian answered. What company, V? I work for the government, Davian said softly. It was the truth. Fowler let out a harsh, derisive scoff. Right, the government. You look real official in that sweatshirt. Step out of the vehicle. Davian did not immediately move. Officer, I've provided my identification. If you're going to write me a citation for the taillight, I'll gladly sign it. But I'd rather not step out of the car in the rain unless I am being detained. Fowler's hand gripped his radio. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. Step out of the car now, or I'm pulling you out. The air outside the car was bitter and damp, carrying the sharp scent of wet asphalt and impending trouble. Davian unbuckled his seatbelt with slow, deliberate movements. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. At 6'2", Davian was taller than Fowler, which seemed to agitate the young officer even more. Turn around, face the car. Put your hands on the roof. Fowler barked, his voice climbing an octave. Davian complied, placing his palms flat against the cold, wet roof of the Mercedes. He spread his feet. For the record, officer, I do not consent to any searches of my person or my vehicle. Shut up, Fowler said. He stepped in hard, using his forearm to press Davian against the roof, while his other hand roughly patted down Davian's waistline pockets and legs. He was looking for a weapon, but more than that, he was establishing physical dominance. He found nothing but a set of keys and a cell phone. Unit 12 to dispatch. I need an additional unit at the Oakwood Strip Mall. Suspect is being uncooperative, Fowler said into his shoulder mic. Copy Unit 12. Unit 7 is en route. Within 2 minutes, a second cruiser tore into the parking lot, lights flashing. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell stepped out. Mitchell was a 20-year veteran of the force. He was in his late 40s, carrying an extra 30 pounds around his midsection, with a face permanently etched in a cynical scowl. Mitchell was Fowler's shift supervisor, and more importantly, he was Chief Hayes's right-hand man on the street. Mitchell was the guy who taught rookies like Fowler how to bend the law until it broke and how to bury the pieces. What do we got, Brian? Mitchell asked, striding over his thumbs tucked casually into his duty belt. Caught him drifting on Elm. Fowler lied again. Pulled him over. He's driving a corporate lease out of Delaware, being evasive about where he works, refusing to answer questions. And Sergeant, I smell marijuana coming from the cabin. Mitchell looked at Davian, who was still standing by the car, then looked at Fowler. Mitchell knew there was no marijuana. He knew Fowler was fishing. But this was how the game was played. Is that right? Mitchell said, turning a cold gaze on Davian. You smoking dope in this nice car, buddy? There is no marijuana in the vehicle, Davian said, his voice remaining eerily level. And I have not been evasive. I answered his questions. I am formally stating again, I do not consent to a search of this vehicle. Mitchell chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Well, Davian, here's the thing about the law. Once my officer smells an illegal narcotic, your consent doesn't matter anymore. That's probable cause. Brian tossed the car. Fowler grinned. He grabbed his flashlight and eagerly leaned into the driver's side of the Mercedes. He began tearing through the pristine interior. He ripped the contents of the glove box out, tossing registration papers and maintenance logs onto the passenger seat. He jammed his hands between the leather seats, pulling up floor mats, completely reckless in his search. Davian watched silently from the pavement. He wasn't afraid. He was taking mental notes. Every violation of protocol, every civil rights breach, every lie, it was all being logged in his mind. "Trunk," Mitchell ordered. Fowler popped the trunk release from the cabin. He walked around to the back and lifted the lid. Inside there was no spare tire, no jumper cables. There was only a heavy-duty black Pelican case secured with 2 thick steel padlocks. Fowler tapped the case with his flashlight. "What's in the box, Dave?" "That is private property," Davion said. "And it is locked. Even with your fabricated probable cause regarding a smell in the cabin, you do not have a warrant to breach a locked container in the trunk." Mitchell stepped closer to Davion, invading his personal space. "You've got a lot of legal words for a guy sitting in a parking lot at midnight. I'm going to ask you once. Give me the keys to the padlocks, or I'm getting the bolt cutters from my cruiser, and we're taking it apart. If you cut those locks," Davion said, his eyes locking onto Mitchell's, "you will be making a career-ending mistake. That is not a threat, Sergeant. That is a fact. I strongly advise you to close the trunk, issue your citation, and let me go." Mitchell's face flushed red. He hated being challenged. He hated the absolute absence of fear in this man's eyes. In Greymore, people begged. They cried. They got angry. They didn't stand there like they owned the pavement beneath their feet. "Get the bolt cutters, Brian," Mitchell snapped. Sergeant Fowler said, hesitating for a fraction of a second. "What if it's cash or guns?" "Then we bag him for trafficking," Mitchell said smoothly. "Get the cutters." As Fowler jogged back to the cruiser, Davion finally decided the game had gone far enough. He had let them walk right into the trap, letting them demonstrate their willingness to manufacture evidence, conduct illegal searches, and destroy property. They had given him everything he needed to establish a pattern of behavior for the federal indictment. "Sergeant Mitchell," Davion said, his tone shifting. The polite, compliant citizen vanished. The voice that replaced it was authoritative, sharp, and cut through the cold air like a razor. "Stop your officer right now. If he touches that case, you are tampering with federal evidence." Mitchell laughed openly. "Federal evidence? Who do you think you are, man?" Fowler returned with heavy orange bolt cutters. He stepped up to the trunk. "Officer Fowler," Davion warned, "do not touch that box." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Fowler suddenly shouted, dropping the cutters and drawing his taser, aiming the red laser dot directly at Davion's chest. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and interfering with a police investigation." Davion didn't flinch as the taser's laser danced across his sweater. He slowly turned around and placed his hands behind his back. Fowler holstered. The taser grabbed Davion's wrists with unnecessary force and slapped the heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists, ratcheting them down tight. The metal bit sharply into Davion's skin. "Got you now, tough guy," Fowler whispered in Davion's ear. He grabbed Davion by the bicep and shoved him roughly against the side of the cruiser. "You're going to a county cell. We'll get a warrant for the box while you rot in processing." Sergeant Mitchell walked over looking smug. "See, if you had just cooperated, maybe you'd be sleeping in your own bed tonight. Now we need to process your property. Brian, get his wallet. Let's run a deep background check on Mr. Reynolds." Fowler reached into Davion's front jacket pocket where Davion had placed his wallet after returning his driver's license. Fowler pulled out the dark leather bifold. It felt heavier than a normal wallet. "Let's see what else you're hiding," Fowler muttered. Fowler flipped the wallet open under the harsh glare of the cruiser's spotlight. Time seemed to stop in the Greymore strip mall parking lot. The beam of light caught the solid gold shield pinned to the left side of the leather. It wasn't a standard police badge. It was an eagle perched over the scales of justice enameled in blue and gold. The lettering was unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. On the right side of the wallet, a laminated federal identification card stared back at them. The photo was of Davion looking stern in a suit and tie. The text next to the photo read, Davian A. Reynolds, Supervisory Special Agent, Department of Justice. Public Corruption Unit Fowler stopped breathing. The smug, aggressive sneer completely vanished from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His hands began to tremble. The wallet shook in his grip. "What is it?" Mitchell asked, noticing his officer's sudden paralysis. "Does he have warrants?" Fowler couldn't speak. He just slowly turned the wallet around so Mitchell could see it. Sergeant Mitchell squinted at the leather. When his eyes recognized the gold shield, all the color instantly drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark and was waiting for the impact. "Oh my God!" Fowler whispered, his voice cracking. Mitchell looked from the badge to the man currently handcuffed against his cruiser. The realization hit him like a freight train. The unmarked Mercedes, the corporate lease, the unshakable calm, the warning about federal evidence in the locked Pelican case. They hadn't pulled over a random civilian. They had pulled over the FBI. "Take the cuffs off Brian," Mitchell said, his voice tight, choked with sudden panic. "Take them off now." Fowler scrambled to retrieve his handcuff key. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the key on the wet pavement. He cursed, dropped to his knees to find it stood back up, and fumbled blindly at Davian's wrists. "Agent Reynolds." Mitchell stammered, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by a desperate groveling tone. "Sir, there's been a massive misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were." The cuffs clicked open. Davian rolled his shoulders, bringing his hands to the front, and slowly rubbed his wrists where the steel had dug in. He turned to face the two terrified officers. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. The absolute stillness in his demeanor was far more terrifying than anger. "You're right, Sergeant Mitchell. You didn't know who I was," Davian said, reaching out and plucking his wallet from Fowler's trembling fingers. He tucked it back into his jacket. "And that is exactly the point." "Sir, we were just doing our jobs." Fowler pleaded, his eyes wide, and panicked. "We got a report of a swerving vehicle. It was a routine safety stop." "We both know that's a lie," Brian, Davian said softly. "Just like the taillight was a lie. Just like the smell of marijuana was a lie. You profiled a driver, you manufactured probable cause, you illegally searched a vehicle, and you attempted to destroy locked property without a warrant. And when I verbally asserted my Fourth Amendment rights, you arrested me." Mitchell swallowed hard. "Agent Reynolds, please. Let's just step back. We can wipe the body cams. We can expunge the CAD report. This never happened. You get in your car and you drive home. We apologize." Davian looked at Mitchell with cold pity. "You think this is about tonight? You think this is just a traffic stop gone wrong?" Davian walked slowly toward the trunk of the Mercedes. He gestured to the heavy black Pelican case. "You wanted to know what was in the box," Brian, Davian asked. "You wanted to know so badly you were going to use bolt cutters." Fowler remained violently silent, staring at the ground. "That box," Davian continued, his voice ringing out in the quiet, damp night, "contains 2 years of federal wiretaps. It contains financial records linking Chief Hayes to embezzled civil asset forfeiture funds. It contains 74 sworn affidavits from citizens of Greymore, whose rights you and your colleagues have violated under the color of law. That box contains the death warrant for the Greymore Police Department." Mitchell stumbled backward, leaning against his cruiser for support. He looked like he was going to be sick. You were investigating us." "I was finishing my investigation tonight," Davian corrected him. "I just spent 14 hours briefing the United States Attorney. We were planning to unseal the indictments on Thursday. But I have to admit, Sergeant, I was missing one tiny piece of the puzzle. The defense was going to argue that the patrol officers were just following vague orders, that it wasn't a systemic, ingrained culture of corruption on the street level." Davian held up his wrists where the red marks from the tight handcuffs were clearly visible. "Thank you, Brian," Davian said, looking directly at the young officer. "Your dash cam and the audio from your shoulder mic tonight just gave me the smoking gun to prove systemic, unprovoked civil rights abuses. You didn't just arrest an FBI agent tonight. You handed me the entire department on a silver platter." Davian reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number, put it on speaker, and waited. A voice answered on the second ring. "Reynolds, tell me you're home and sleeping. Change of plans. Director." Davian said, never taking his eyes off the two officers. "I need the tactical team spun up. We aren't waiting for Thursday. We're executing the arrest warrants for Chief Hayes and the Greymore command staff tonight. And send a squad to the Oakwood Strip Mall on Route 119. I have 2 officers here who need to surrender their badges." The arrival of the federal government did not happen with a slow build. It happened like a thunderclap. Within 15 minutes of Agent Davian Reynolds' phone call, the dark, rain-swept parking lot of the Oakwood Strip Mall was swarmed by 4 unmarked black Chevrolet Tahoes. They boxed in the 2 Greymore police cruisers with militaristic precision. Heavily armed agents from the FBI's regional SWAT element poured out their tactical gear, shedding water under the halogen lights. Officer Brian Fowler and Sergeant Thomas Mitchell were stripped of their Glock sidearms, their duty belts and their badges before they could even formulate a coherent sentence. Fowler was openly weeping, the adrenaline crash rendering his legs completely useless. 2 federal agents had to physically support him as they zip-tied his wrists and guided him into the back of a Tahoe. Mitchell remained silent, his jaw locked tight, staring with dead eyes at the pavement. He knew the protocol. He knew that when the Bureau moved this fast, the game was entirely over. There would be no union rep to save him tonight. There would be no friendly judge to sign a suppression order. He was ushered into a separate vehicle isolated from his rookie. Davian Reynolds handed the keys to his unmarked Mercedes to a junior agent. "Take it straight to the secure subterranean lot at the federal building. Nobody touches the Pelican case in the trunk until I am physically present." "Yes, sir," the agent replied, slipping behind the wheel. Davian climbed into the passenger seat of the lead tactical command vehicle. Director Michael Kavanaugh's voice cracked over the encrypted radio channel. "Reynolds, we have 22 arrest warrants active. Simultaneous breaches are authorized. We're taking the precinct and the chief's residence concurrently. Do we have a green light?" Davian looked at his watch. It was 1:14 a.m. "Green light, Director. Tear it down." Across town, in the exclusive gated enclave of Whispering Pines, Chief of Police Warren Hayes was sound asleep in his custom-built 6-bedroom colonial. Hayes was a man who lived far beyond the means of a municipal police chief's salary. His driveway boasted a new Range Rover and a vintage Porsche 911. His offshore bank accounts held just over $3 million money skimmed, extorted and laundered from unconstitutional civil asset forfeitures spanning a decade. At exactly 1:22 a.m., the tranquility of Whispering Pines was shattered. An armored Lenko Bearcat crushed the decorative iron gates of Hayes's driveway, tearing them off their hinges with a shriek of bending metal. 24 FBI tactical agents stacked up on the custom mahogany front door. A hydraulic breaching ram defeated the deadbolts in less than a second. "FBI federal search warrant hands where we can see them." The shouts echoed through the cavernous, marble-tiled foyer. Upstairs, Chief Hayes jolted awake. He reached for the Sig Sauer P226 on his nightstand, his cop instincts taking over. But before his fingers could even graze the cold steel of the grip, the heavy oak door of his master bedroom was kicked open. Blinding tactical strobes filled the room. Red laser dots painted his chest. "Get your hands off the weapon! Do it now!" Special Agent Sarah Jenkins ordered her M4 carbine leveled squarely at his head. Hayes froze, blinking against the intense light. The arrogance of a man who had ruled his town like a feudal lord flared up defensively. "Do you know who the hell I am? I am the Chief of Police. You are in my jurisdiction." Jenkins didn't blink. "Warren Hayes, you are under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion, and multiple violations of Title 18, United States Code, Section 241 and 242. Get out of the bed and put your hands behind your back." Hayes's face drained of color. He was pulled from his silk sheets, forced onto the plush carpet, and handcuffed in his pajamas. As they marched him down his grand staircase, Hayes desperately tried to salvage his crumbling empire. "I need to make a phone call. Let me call Mayor Corliss. This is a political hit job." Agent Jenkins gave him a tight, pitying smile as they walked out into the cold rain. Mayor Corliss was arrested 10 minutes ago at the airport, Chief. He was trying to board a charter flight to the Cayman Islands. He didn't make it. Simultaneously, the Graymore Police Department headquarters, a modern glass-fronted fortress, built entirely on the backs of exorbitant traffic fines and seized civilian property, was besieged. Night shift officers drinking coffee and laughing in the break room were suddenly staring down the barrels of federal submachine guns. Agents seized the dispatch center, ripping the communications operators away from their consoles to prevent them from tipping off any patrol cars still on the street. Down in the basement level, Captain Robert O'Neill, the head of internal affairs and Hayes's chief fixer, heard the commotion. Panicking, O'Neill sprinted into the server room, locking the heavy steel door behind him. He grabbed a fire axe from the wall and began frantically swinging it at the primary server racks, desperately trying to destroy the hard drives that contained the department's altered CAD reports and illegal surveillance data. He managed 2 weak swings before a specialized federal breaching charge blew the hinges off the server room door. The concussive blast knocked O'Neill to the floor, deafening him. Federal cybercrimes agents swarmed in, securing the damaged hardware, while O'Neill was violently zip-tied and dragged out of the room. By 3 a.m., the Graymore Police Department effectively no longer existed. The precinct was a federal crime scene entirely occupied by the FBI. Every marked cruiser had been ordered back to the station. Every officer on the payroll was being disarmed, corralled into the gymnasium and identified. The hunters had become the captured. The air in Interrogation Room 4 at the federal building was sterile cold and smelled faintly of ozone and stale coffee. The digital clock on the grey concrete wall read 8:15 a.m. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell sat at the steel table. He had been given a paper cup of water and nothing else for 6 hours. His uniform was rumpled, the spot where his silver badge used to rest now, just a patch of frayed fabric. Next to him sat Arthur Pendleton, a high-priced union defense attorney who looked visibly sweating and out of his depth. The heavy metal door opened. Agent Davian Reynolds walked in. He was no longer wearing the casual crewneck sweater. He was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal grey Tom Ford suit, a crisp white shirt and a navy tie. He carried a thick red rope legal folder and a laptop. He sat down across from Mitchell, opening the folder with agonizing slowness. "Good morning, Thomas," Davian said, his voice smooth professional and completely devoid of the intimidation tactics Graymore cops favoured. Pendleton cleared his throat. "Agent Reynolds, my client is a decorated 20-year veteran. The traffic stop last night was an unfortunate misunderstanding and error in judgment by a rookie officer that my client was attempting to de-escalate. We are prepared to offer a full apology and brief administrative leave to settle this matter." Davian didn't look at the lawyer. He kept his eyes locked on Mitchell. "Mr. Pendleton, this is not an internal affairs review. I am not here to suspend your client. I am here to dismantle his life." Davian turned the laptop around so Mitchell could see the screen. He hit play. The high-definition footage from Officer Fowler's dashcam filled the screen, synced perfectly with the crisp audio from Fowler's lapel microphone. It showed the entire stop. It showed the unprovoked aggression. It caught the exact moment Fowler lied about the taillight and the exact moment he lied about the smell of marijuana. It recorded Mitchell explicitly ordering his officer to retrieve bolt cutters to destroy a locked federal evidence container without a warrant. Title 18, USC, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Davian recited his tone surgical. "You and your officer conspired to illegally detain, search and seize property from a citizen without probable cause. That alone carries up to 10 years in federal prison. We kept that town safe." Mitchell rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. It was the tired, broken mantra of every dirty cop. "You don't know what it takes. We kept the garbage out of Graymore." "You kept the town lucrative," Davian corrected sharply. He pulled a thick stack of printed ledgers from the red rope folder and slid them across the table. Mitchell looked down. His breath hitched. "These are the accounting records from the department's Civil Asset Forfeiture Fund," Davian said. "Over the last 4 years, your unit stopped over 1,200 out-of-town drivers. You seized cash vehicles and jewelry under the guise of suspected narcotics trafficking. You never filed criminal charges against 80% of those drivers, but you kept their property. It's a textbook shakedown." "I was just following orders," Mitchell said, his eyes darting to his lawyer. "Chief Hayes directed the aggressive interdiction units. I just ran my shift." Davian leaned forward, intertwining his fingers. "Here is where your situation goes from bad to terminal, Thomas. Do you remember the corporate lease on the Mercedes you pulled over last night?" Mitchell frowned, confused by the pivot. "You said it was a government shell company." "I lied," Davian said simply. "The FBI didn't lease that vehicle. We seized it. The Delaware LLC that holds the lease on that Mercedes is called Apex Holdings. Does that name ring a bell?" Mitchell's eyes widened in slow, creeping horror. "Yes," Davian whispered. "Apex Holdings is the primary shell company Chief Warren Hayes uses to launder the cash he skims off the top of the department's forfeiture fund. He's been stealing from his own officers' slush fund. We tracked the money, $3 million sitting in offshore accounts under his name. When you pulled me over last night, you weren't just profiling a black man in a nice car. You were unwittingly pulling over a vehicle registered to your own boss's money laundering operation." Pendleton, the lawyer, slumped back in his chair, taking his glasses off and rubbing his temples. He knew a checkmate when he saw one. "Hayes sold you out." "Thomas." Davian continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense frequency. "He let you and your boys take all the risk on the street. He let you perform the unconstitutional stops. He let you rack up the citizen complaints. And while you were making your $70,000 salary, he was quietly siphoning millions into the Caymans. And right now, in the interrogation room next door, Chief Hayes is trying to cut a deal with the U.S. attorney. He is currently blaming you. He says you ran a rogue shift." "That lying son of a bitch!" Mitchell hissed, slamming his fist onto the steel table. The loyalty among thieves instantly evaporated. "He's giving us the street cops to save himself." Davian lied flawlessly. In reality, Hayes was stonewalling, demanding a lawyer and refusing to speak. But the classic prisoner's dilemma was the oldest and most effective tool in the federal playbook. If Hayes signs his proffer first, he gets 10 years in a minimum security camp. You, Fowler, and the rest of your shift will get hit with the full weight of the RICO statute. You will do 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. You will be a cop in general population. Davian let that terrifying reality hang in the cold air. He let Mitchell imagine the cell doors closing. He let him imagine the faces of the men he had wrongfully imprisoned waiting for him in the yard. Davian slid a blank federal proffer agreement across the table, along with a sleek black pen. "I don't need you to prove the traffic stops, Thomas. I already have that," Davian said, his eyes drilling into the broken sergeant. "I need you to testify on the record that Warren Hayes orchestrated the enterprise. I need you to confirm the chain of command for the extortion. You sign this, you testify, and I will recommend to the judge that you serve no more than 3 years in a protective custody facility. You keep your pension. You see your kids again." Mitchell stared at the paper. His hands were trembling much like Fowler's had the night before. The arrogant, swaggering street boss was gone. In his place was just a frightened middle-aged man who realized he had played a rigged game and lost everything. Mitchell looked at his lawyer. Pendleton just gave a grim, slow nod. There was no defense against this mountain of federal evidence. With a shaky breath, Mitchell picked up the pen. He didn't read the document. He just flipped to the back page and signed his name, officially turning state's evidence and driving the final nail into the coffin of the Graymore Police Department. By 9 a.m., the sun had fully risen over Graymore, casting a harsh, unforgiving daylight on the wreckage of its corrupt law enforcement apparatus. News helicopters circled like vultures over the municipal building. Satellite trucks from every major national news network clogged the pristine, tree-lined streets. The citizens of Greymore woke up to find federal barricades blocking the entrances to their police department. Agents in windbreakers carrying boxes of physical evidence and hard drives marched in a continuous damning parade from the glass doors to a fleet of waiting transport vans. Inside the federal building downtown, Supervisory Special Agent Davian Reynolds wasn't watching the news coverage. He was standing behind the one-way glass of Interrogation Room 2, nursing his first cup of black coffee in 24 hours. On the other side of the glass sat Chief Warren Hayes. Hayes looked drastically different from the untouchable suburban warlord he had been the day before. Stripped of his tailored uniform and his gold stars, wearing a standard-issue orange federal jumpsuit, he looked smaller, older. Yet the stubborn arrogance that had fueled his criminal enterprise still clung to him. Sitting next to him was Richard Caldwell, a ruthless high-dollar criminal defense attorney, known for untangling wealthy clients from federal indictments. Davian took a final sip of his coffee, set the cup down, and walked into the interrogation room. He didn't bring a thick folder this time. He only brought a single manila envelope. He sat down opposite Hayes. Agent Reynolds. Caldwell began immediately, his voice dripping with condescension. My client's arrest last night was a theatrical overreach, a midnight raid with tactical teams, over some administrative discrepancies in the Civil Forfeiture Fund. We will be filing motions for immediate release, and we will be seeking sanctions against your office for this stunt. Davian ignored the lawyer completely. He kept his eyes fixed on Hayes. Good morning, Warren, Davian said. His voice was calm, conversational, almost friendly. It was the exact tone he had used with Officer Fowler the night before. I spoke with Sergeant Mitchell an hour ago. He signed a proffer agreement. He gave us the entire operational structure of the Highway Interdiction Unit. He gave us the quotas you mandated. He gave us everything. Hayes smirked, leaning back in his metal chair. Tommy Mitchell is a scared street cop trying to save his own skin. He'll say whatever you tell him to say. It's hearsay. I'm the chief of police. I don't conduct traffic stops. I oversee macro-level departmental strategy. If a few aggressive officers on the night shift bent the rules, that's an internal affairs issue. You can't tie their actions to my desk. That's the beauty of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, Warren, Davian replied smoothly. I don't need you on the street. I just need to prove you profited from the enterprise. Caldwell chuckled. Good luck proving my client had any knowledge of or received any direct financial benefit from alleged rogue street-level seizures. Davian reached out and opened the manila envelope. He slid a single crisp sheet of paper across the table. Let's talk about Apex Holdings, Davian said. Hayes's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Never heard of it. That's interesting, Davian said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. Because Apex Holdings is a Delaware LLC set up 3 years ago. It's the primary corporate entity holding over $3 million in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It's also the shell company you've been using to launder the cash seizures your officers bring in before depositing them into the municipal fund. Speculation, Caldwell interrupted. You can trace an LLC, but you can't tie the beneficial ownership to Chief Hayes without violating international banking privacy laws, which you know you don't have the jurisdiction to breach. You're right, Richard. Davian nodded agreeably. The Caymans are notoriously uncooperative. Getting a subpoena for those banking records would take years, and even then it would be a coin toss. Davian tapped the single sheet of paper sitting in front of Hayes. So, we didn't use a subpoena. Davian explained, his voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling finality. We used a honeypot. Hayes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he finally looked at the document. It was a wire transfer receipt. 6 months ago, Davian continued, we arrested a mid-level money launderer operating out of Miami, a man named Gregory Vance. Do you know Gregory Warren? He's the financial fixer who set up Apex Holdings for you. All the blood instantly drained from Hayes's face. He stared at the name on the wire transfer. Gregory didn't want to go to federal prison, Davian said softly. So he agreed to cooperate. We took over his communications. For the last 6 months, every time you thought you were securely messaging Gregory to transfer skimmed Greymore police funds into your Cayman accounts, you were actually messaging a federal agent in our cyber division. The silence in the room was absolute. The hum of the HVAC unit suddenly sounded like a jet engine. But we didn't just monitor the transfers, Warren, Davian said, delivering the final crushing blow. We intercepted them. The Cayman accounts never existed. For 6 months, you have been voluntarily wiring extorted cash directly into a secure escrow account controlled by the United States Department of Justice. We have the digital fingerprint of every transaction initiated from your personal IP address, using your secure passwords, depositing funds into our trap. Caldwell, the high-priced attorney, was staring at the document in stunned disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at his client, realizing he was defending a walking corpse. And to add insult to injury, Davian added a faint, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. We used some of those intercepted funds to lease the undercover vehicles for this operation. When your officers pulled me over last night in that Mercedes, they were pulling over a car paid for by your own laundered money. You financed your own federal takedown. Hayes stared at the paper. His hands began to shake. The walls of his carefully constructed untouchable kingdom had just imploded, leaving him entirely exposed. There was no political cover. There was no legal loophole. He was trapped in a federal cage of his own making. You didn't just break the law, Warren, Davian said, standing up from the table. You perverted the very concept of justice for profit. You turned a police department into an armed street gang, and now you're going to pay the tab. Wait! Hayes croaked, his voice cracking. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the desperate, hollow panic of a cornered animal. What kind of deal can we work out I can give you, the mayor? Corliss knew about all of it. He took a 30% cut of the municipal fund to approve my budgets. I can testify against him. Davian looked down at the former chief of police with undisguised contempt. Mayor Corliss surrendered to the FBI at the airport last night, Davian said coldly. He already gave us his statement. He blamed the entire operation on you. The bus has already left the station. Warren and you are under the tires. Davian turned and walked toward the heavy steel door. Agent Reynolds, Hayes yelled, standing up, his handcuffs clinking against the table. You can't do this. I have 25 years on the job. Davian paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. So did the people you swore to protect, Davian replied. Enjoy federal prison. He opened the door and walked out, leaving Warren Hayes to the deafening silence of his ruined life. The fallout from the Greymore corruption bust was swift, absolute, and sent shockwaves through the national law enforcement community. Within 48 hours of the raids, the governor signed an emergency executive order officially disbanding the Greymore Police Department. The badges were melted down, the cruisers were auctioned off. The glass-fronted headquarters was seized by the state and repurposed as a community outreach center. Law enforcement duties for the town were permanently handed over to the county sheriff's office, operating under the strict watchful eye of a federal consent decree. The legal bloodbath that followed was unprecedented in its efficiency. Faced with the insurmountable mountain of wiretaps, financial records, and the damning dashcam footage of Agent Reynolds' traffic stop, the blue wall of silence completely collapsed. It became a race to the prosecutor's office. Mayor Arthur Corliss pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, true to his proffer agreement, testified in open court against his superiors. Because of his cooperation, he avoided the RICO charges, but pleaded guilty to deprivation of civil rights. He was sentenced to 4 years in a low-security facility and permanently lost his pension. Officer Brian Fowler, the aggressive rookie who initiated the fatal traffic stop, was utterly broken by the ordeal. He pleaded guilty to federal obstruction and assault under color of law. He was given 5 years of federal probation, a lifetime ban from ever holding a security or law enforcement position, and was forced to complete 1,000 hours of community service in the inner-city neighborhoods he used to proudly profile. But the hammer fell hardest on the architect of the misery. Warren Hayes refused to take a plea. His ego, refusing to accept defeat until the very end. The federal trial lasted only 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. He was found guilty on 22 counts, including racketeering money, laundering extortion, and systemic deprivation of civil rights. The federal judge, visibly disgusted by Hayes's betrayal of the badge, showed no mercy. Warren Hayes was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. But for Davian Reynolds, the convictions weren't the real victory. The real victory happened 6 months after the trial in a small, quiet courtroom in the civil division. Davian sat in the back row of the gallery, wearing a simple grey suit, watching as a young black man named Caleb Wright stood before the judge. 2 years prior, Caleb had been driving through Graymore on his way to buy a used catering van to start his own small business. He had $12,000 in legitimate tax-paid cash in his trunk, and Graymore Interdiction Unit had pulled him over for driving 3 miles over the speed limit. They claimed a police dog alerted to the scent of narcotics on the cash, a notoriously unscientific and easily manipulated tactic. They didn't arrest Caleb. They just took his money. They left him on the side of the road with nothing but a receipt telling him if he wanted it back, he'd have to hire a lawyer and prove the money was innocent in civil court, a process that would cost more than the $12,000 itself. It had ruined Caleb's dream, forced him into bankruptcy, and nearly destroyed his marriage. "Mr. Wright," the civil judge said, looking down at the paperwork provided by the Department of Justice. "The federal government has reviewed the circumstances of your asset seizure by the former Graymore Police Department. We have found no probable cause, no evidence of criminal wrongdoing, and clear evidence of systemic extortion by the seizing officers." The judge stamped the document with a heavy, satisfying thud. "The Department of Justice is hereby releasing the seized funds back to you in full with an additional federal grant for compensatory damages. A check for $45,000 is waiting for you with the clerk. Good luck with your catering business, son." Caleb Wright dropped his head, his shoulders shaking as he quietly wept. His wife hugged him, burying her face in his neck. It was the sound of a nightmare finally ending. It was the sound of a broken promise being repaired. Davian watched them embrace. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need their thanks. He just stood up quietly, pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. He walked to his unmarked dark blue sedan, a new one this time, and climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key, the engine purring to life. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he drove past the city limits sign for Graymore. A county sheriff's cruiser was parked near the sign. The deputy inside was writing a report, ignoring the flow of traffic passing by. He wasn't glaring at the drivers. He wasn't running plates looking for an excuse. He was just doing his job. Davian smiled faintly, merging onto the highway. The flashing red and blue lights used to mean a bad night in Graymore. Now they just meant the law had finally arrived. Did this story of absolute justice make your blood boil and your heart race? True power isn't about the badge you wear. It's about the integrity you uphold, and watching a corrupt system tear itself apart from the inside is the ultimate satisfaction. If you loved this deep dive into real-life drama, undercover stings and federal takedowns, do not leave without hitting that like button